Dragon Ball is one of the most influential anime-manga in the history of the medium. From the original to Z and now Super, with its epic fights, deep and ever-expanding lore, the late great Akira Toriyama's once comedy-adjacent kung fu manga, inspired in part by Journey to the West, has cemented itself as one of the most epic pieces of fiction for an entire generation. Dragon Ball's manga roots have morphed into a dominant franchise with massive footprints in manga, video games, anime, and cinema. Its legacy cannot be denied, but its current state has been and continues to be a lightning rod for debate. Since its inception, Dragon Ball Super has been controversial in almost all aspects. From its story, its additions to the lore, to its much maligned production schedule in the early years of the anime's run in the mid-2010s. And now, with the tragic and sudden passing of Akira Toriyama in early 2024, we'll likely never know for absolute certain how it was all meant to come to a close according to the creator of the series. Life goes on, however, and Toriyama's legacy will be honored as long as people still continue to appreciate his creation. And with the return of the Dragon Ball Super manga ambiguously looming in the not-so-distant future, we here at Blue Milk Boys thought it would be a good idea to give a super State of the Union. In this series, we'll be going through every arc of the sequel to Dragon Ball Z with considerations to each of the mediums these stories exist in. I'll be covering all the material that exists in anime form, including the movies, with Spencer hopping in with all of the corresponding manga material, or lack thereof. All to answer the question, does Dragon Ball Super justify its own existence, or is it a stain on the legacy of one of the greatest contributions to the shonen genre in history? Today, we hope to begin to answer that question by discussing Dragon Ball's big return to the screen, Battle of Gods. In 2013, Akira Toriyama returned to pen the definitive continuation of the Dragon Ball story. Despite the ending to Z seeming pretty conclusive, there was always a thirst for more, as evidenced by the existence of shows like Dragon Ball GT and the continuation of the popularity of the franchise once it was brought to the United States. However, the official follow-up came in the form of a 2013 theatrical feature film. Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods served as a continuation of Z, rather than what we would come to know it as at present, which is the first arc of Dragon Ball Super. For a series that lay long dormant, with its relevance culturally being supplanted by a legendary catalog of video games and repackages of the anime material like Dragon Ball Kai, the fact that this was a new story coming straight from Toriyama himself meant that there was a possibility that Dragon Ball was back. The story unfolds with the introduction of Beerus, the fearsome god of destruction, a being that sits above all, even the Kais that we've been introduced to, awakening from a 39-year-long slumber. Beerus sets out on a quest to find the Super Saiyan God, a warrior prophesied to him in a vision, one with immense power. His search, of course, leads him to King Kai's planet, where Goku is undergoing some training, and naturally, Goku immediately wants to fight, but is quickly overwhelmed by the Destruction God's strength, even at full power Super Saiyan 3. As the saga progresses, the Z-Fighters learn about the Super Saiyan God ritual and work together to summon this legendary form for Goku to face Beerus in a climactic showdown, marking a pretty big shift in the story for how Goku usually achieves his transformations, relying almost solely on others and their willingness to help him, rather than their support and guidance as he trains by himself to become stronger. In typical Dragon Ball fashion, Goku and his allies must navigate the threat posed by Beerus while also learning about the broader cosmos and the hierarchy of the gods. The battle between Beerus and Goku as a Super Saiyan God reaches staggering levels of power, showing the evolution of Goku's abilities. Despite Goku blowing the roof completely off the previously established power scale by the entirety of the Dragon Ball series prior, he is unable to defeat Beerus, but has tasted a new level of power, having internalized or even absorbed the Super Saiyan God transformation, while providing enough amusement for Beerus to pique his interest and enlist him as a pseudo-mentor for the new landscape of Dragon Ball Super. This arc exists in 3 separate mediums, and I think it's pretty clear that the movie was and remains the best iteration of Toriyama's definitive follow-up to Z. I think we're all familiar with how badly Toei butchered the production schedule for the Super anime, and how dire the consequences ended up being. I'll let Spencer deliberate on the quality of this arc in manga form, but truthfully, the return of Dragon Ball Z in the form of an epic feature film was one of the best ways you could kick off its revival in hindsight. At that point in time, Battle of Gods was considered one of the better Dragon Ball movies, which says a lot considering that filmography. From the perspective of utility, the story was a little rough around the edges, and honestly, pretty light on actual material, which is more evident when the story was adapted into the anime. There's just not a lot that happens. The length the story goes to in trying to retrofit Beerus' existence into the story either works for you or it doesn't. Personally for me, it did. The fact that Toriyama at least attempted to weave the story's prior events, something that Dragon Ball does when it's at its best, by utilizing the hierarchy of the Kais and how they serve under the gods of destruction, went very far for me in terms of how invested I'm able to get in this random cat guy that shows up out of nowhere and is automatically stronger than anyone we've ever seen before. The reason for this perceived roughness around the edges, in my eyes, is that the act of releasing this film was a proverbial testing of the waters to see how receptive the viewing public would be to new Dragon Ball content in the 2010s. Considering we're picking back up off the heels of Majin Buu, the stakes being placed so high seemingly out of nowhere felt artificial at times. But if anything, it was clear that they were doing the best with the hand that they were dealt. And it did serve as a clear indicator that a new level of the Dragon Ball universe was being unlocked for us, and that rubbing shoulders with gods, new revelations about the world our characters have been inhabiting, and the ever-increasing scale of power were going to be our new standard.
As we get along in the series, we will see that the Dragon Ball Super manga is a borderline different telling of the story. However, that is not the case for the Battle of Gods arc. The manga retells the events of the movie in a near identical manner, but in a much abbreviated way. In fact, the manga finishes the story of the movie in just 4 chapters. Ultimately, I feel as though this was for the best. Battle of Gods is not necessarily an arc in the same sense as the Android Saga, whereas in the Android Saga is an actual full-blown Dragon Ball arc with a fully fleshed out narrative that had a clear beginning, middle, and end. It was a way to set the tone for what the series was going to be like and set itself apart in terms of scale. That was always one thing that bothered me about Dragon Ball GT. It was almost like they went backwards before going beyond in the late stages of the show. Even then, the villains just felt like slightly more powerful Cell. In Super, it lets you know right off the bat that what we viewed as the pinnacle of power in Dragon Ball Z is no longer relevant. Instead of stringing the character's strength along, it abruptly lets the audience know that we are making a leap in power similar to the one shown from Dragon Ball to Dragon Ball Z. The only main difference between the movie and manga is that they go a little overboard with the fight between Beerus and Super Saiyan God Goku. They describe their fight as potentially destroying the universe due to the impact of their fists. The first time I read it, I thought it was cool, but ultimately raises a lot of questions when more powerful characters fight each other in the show. Dragon Ball fans are notorious for trying to quantify every action in the show, but I think the manga in particular forces the reader to let go of those connotations and enjoy the visuals and epicness of the moment versus thinking too much about what something means.
Now that we've recapped the events of Battle of Gods and given our general overview on how we think the arc went, we want to kind of get into the weeds a little bit about the stuff that stuck out to us the most from reviewing this material. And I think it goes without saying that the biggest thing that came out of this arc, its most lasting effect and consequence, was the Super Saiyan God form. And I kind of just wanted to get your impression, Spencer, on what this form kind of meant to you as you watched it and how it's kind of been treated over time as the Super series has progressed.
Yeah, Super Saiyan God is one of the most interesting transformations. One thing I actually really like about it is when you think back to the Cell Saga, it kind of established this idea that just becoming more buff and like exerting more power doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best form. In fact, it's like actually kind of like a waste of energy. So I think they really like cultivated that idea in Super Saiyan God. We'll quickly learn that Super Saiyan God means a lot to the manga through the Tournament of Power. So I love the form in the manga because of its importance and how different it is. It gets thrown away really quickly. Like when I watched it in theaters for the first time, I was like, this is really cool. Like I can't wait to see what this means. And you like kind of never see it again other than like moments here or there in the anime and the movies.
That leads us to another kind of byproduct of Super, in the sense that when the anime and manga, because they both started, their serialization around the same time in 2015, this idea of a dual continuity, the fact that the events play out in largely a similar way in terms of how we get from one story beat to the next, but everything that happens in between is kind of subject to whoever is writing their respective story. The way that they approach certain things in the manga are different from the way they approach certain things in the anime, and Super Saiyan God is one of the biggest things because it feels like at first opportunity they did cast the red Super Saiyan God form by the wayside in the anime. It is essentially useless.
Yeah, and it's more of like a speed element. I mean, obviously in this series, we're going to get really into the differences, and it's not really noticeable in this first arc. But in a way, I actually appreciate that the way that this went on. I feel like the people who made the show and the movie and the manga really got creative freedom, which I really enjoyed. I like the idea of like you need to hit these kind of points, but do what you want with it. And I think that they all interpreted it very differently. And it's fun because when you're reading it, you're not just getting what you're watching on the show, like not an abbreviated version in a sense. Like there were like completely different events that happen within them. It's just the beginning and the end that are the same. Everything else that happens in between, it'll like actually like shock you. I feel if you've never read the manga, you're in for a completely different experience.
It kind of introduced the idea of Toriyama leaving these napkin notes for it's like, here's what you need to include in the story, and how you get there is really up to you. And that led to a lot of different things happening in the anime from the manga. And we'll get into it as we progress in the series, but like the idea that Kaioken Super Saiyan Blue doesn't really exist in the manga, and that's kind of a thing that's exclusive to the anime. But both of these things are kind of equally canon, but also like they have their own continuity. So it's strange, but it's also interesting to see how other series like Boruto have adapted this kind of dual continuity mindset as well.
Yeah, like to me, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but I view like Dragon Ball Super, like I think the manga is better than the anime. I prefer to read it than I would to watch it.
I mean, watching it is a chore at times because some of the animation is lowest of the low for Dragon Ball. It's bad.
Yeah, just the whole production. Yeah, the whole production of Dragon Ball.
Yeah, and I made mention of it in my review section. Like the production schedule, like these guys were essentially animating brand new episodes of one of the biggest anime of all time on a week-to-week basis. You had to complete essentially an entire episode of anime in a week, which it showed. And Toei really screwed the production team of Dragon Ball at that time. We saw more towards the end. Like I said, we won't get too far ahead, but these issues kind of got resolved later on in later arcs. But the damage had already been done as far as kind of starting the series off with any kind of momentum, because it was hard to tune in because it looked awful.
It was really bad. But I think to conclude this little section, I would like to go back and try to remember what it felt like when it came out in theaters for the first time, because this is the first thing that any of us knew, like any new content that had happened since GT. And I remember when I was a kid, I liked watching GT. It was on Nickelodeon. And of course, it's a new Dragon Ball series. So as a child, you're locked in, and I don't really have super strong memories about it, I guess. It just didn't really stick with me. And obviously, over the course of time, people have basically forgotten GT for all intents and purposes, outside of like one transformation, which has like made the show. Like if that wasn't in there, the show would have just completely like gone to nothing, and people wouldn't really remember it. But when the movie came out, Battle of Gods, like that was our first taste, and it was like GT was always kind of set up as this is not really Toriyama's thing. He's just kind of like involved roughly. It's more like fan fiction in a weird way.
It was like almost not involved.
Versus this, it was like, yeah, this was Toriyama's continuation of Dragon Ball Z. So it was like really important.
Yeah, it was straight from the source.
And I remember like it was like really fun. Like when it came out, I was like, wow, this is really cool. Like I can't believe this is back, and it's like really back. They didn't half-ass it. It wasn't like a BoJack movie, I guess, where it's just a side story. And they could have done that. Like, they could have made $4 billion. Even like not even necessarily like an alternate universe, just like a villain that is tangentially as powerful, as Majin Buu. Do you know what I mean? And they have to they power it, because that's really what the old movies were about, where they just have to power up to like their maximum, and then
yeah, this random guy appeared. Like I said in my review, it's like they really had to work with the hand that they were dealt in terms of making it believable within the confines of the story that Beerus was stronger than anybody that they had encountered before. But when you're traditionally doing Dragon Ball movies, you can kind of just make somebody up and say like, yeah, he's also just stronger than literally everyone you've ever met before, because there aren't going to be really any lasting consequences to that.
Yeah, because they just like blow up in the end, basically. It was good, man. Like Dragon Ball had a very nice triumphant return. It was safe, but it was also like really satisfying.
for me, it felt really bizarre, honestly, because I feel like everybody's timeline on Dragon Ball prior to Battle of Gods being released was a little kind of not messed up, but like everyone kind of made their, interjection onto it at different times, whether it was, you were around for that original Toonami run, or like you said, watching it on Nickelodeon. I know Dragon Ball Z Kai was on Nickelodeon a lot of the time. And so a lot of people's first impressions of the series were vastly different just because the point in time that they are first being exposed to the series. But this is the first time that like pretty much every Dragon Ball fan was being brought up to speed on what was happening at the exact same time. This is the first time it was being recognized as a worldwide release, and we had things like the internet to be able to kind of experience it all collectively at the same time, in the same way that, people in Japan were able to do when it was coming out on television every single week. And so it really kind of launched us, I think, into a new era of anime where it was more of a global phenomenon. It was more of a thing that was becoming fully accepted, not only just in Japan, not only just in America, but around the world, where the appreciation of it wasn't being hindered by, where you were in the world or what you had access to, because at this point, you're getting pretty close to being able to, I'm pretty sure it got a worldwide release, but at the same time, like, you were able to find it on the internet as well, like, really easily. We were all able to kind of witness the return of Dragon Ball at the same time and not have it kind of trickle into other countries whenever they felt like it was relevant, or that they felt like they could make money off of it. And so it really did kind of just mark a huge shift in just the way we consume anime in general, in my opinion.
The youngins don't know how hard it was. Like, getting anime into the States used to be like pulling teeth.
It had to be, yeah. Like, your only exposure was something that, executives at Cartoon Network deemed had, worldwide appeal. And
it was like Blockbuster and Cartoon Network growing up. Like, that's the only way.
It's your only options. Yep. In conclusion, I'm not sure at the time people knew what the future would hold when the Battle of Gods movie came out in 2013. It would obviously become much clearer 2 years later with the release of the Super anime and manga. However, in hindsight, seeing Goku achieve a new form and clearly elevate the stakes that the characters were operating at, it was a clear signal that they were gearing up for more of the Dragon Ball story to be told. All in all, it was a nice reintroduction to our favorite characters, and it did its job in setting the table for what's to come. Make sure to tap back in with us next time, where we see the super story continue with the return of the Emperor Palpatine of Dragon Ball, Lord Frieza, as we're covering Resurrection F. We'll see you next time!